Welcome back, everybody. Episode 11 of the Late Stage Podcast. And I'm your host, Sinan Schwarting, live from New York. You see it? You can see it. Rocking my informal Knicks gear over a sweatshirt, old school style, with a bad hair day to boot. Kind of got the mad scientist Andrew Garfield Spider-Man look, meaning, outdated from about 20 years ago, whatever that was made. That's from wearing the hood, right? What are you gonna do? But so enough about that. Enough about the jersey. I wish I could say I was wearing it because there was a Knicks game on tonight. There is a Knicks game on tonight, but I'm not that amped about it. We're gonna probably lose again. But I suppose in a sign of the times, a sign of normalcy resuming, life restoring, if you will, the Knicks suck again. So for any fans of normalcy, I guess that's good news. Let's talk about the news today. So enough about a bad hair day or a bad basketball team. Let's talk about the news. So this week I'm going to talk about the U.S. media. I'm doing my power rankings again for folks who have been loyal listeners of the podcast. I used to do one at the end of every episode. Now I'm just going to do one once a month. So for anyone who doesn't want to watch the U.S. mainstream corporate media, I will break it all down for you and let you know what they're talking about so you don't have to find out for yourselves. Of course, first of all, though, I'll talk a little global news, some interesting stuff going on around the world. First of all, Asia, and again, the Middle East, although actually we're spanning the entire continent, the entire broad brush-stroked Asia. So in this case, we're in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East again, and in China, in Beijing. Sort of, so to speak. So in this case, so for any neo-Cold War news buffs, folks on looking for the next World War III story, perhaps this one's for you. So China's Secretary of Defense, Wei Fenghe, apologies for the mispronunciation, I'm sure I didn't get that right, met with the Deputy of Defense Minister of Saudi Arabia. And to summarize, it was sort of a press release, press conference type deal. Not very substantive, but one thing of note, in their thanks for each other and praise, the China's Secretary of Defense thanked Riyadh for its support on issues related to Xinjiang, which is no surprise to anyone. Xinjiang is the region in China specifically where a lot of this Uyghur repression, sort of soft genocide talk, which I'm not going to get into here. Obviously, China's in a lot of heat for that all around the world. A lot of attention being given to that. But Saudi Arabia has notoriously not really given them any guff about it, and in fact has given them some support. Certainly, as far as PR goes, they've supported their independence and their sort of freedom to do whatever it is that they choose to do, which is not particularly surprising. I think Saudi Arabia probably wants people to stay out of their business as much as they can get them to. Jamal Khashoggi, excuse me. I guess as something of a journalist here, I'm wearing a Knicks jersey on a podcast. I don't know if that qualifies, but sorry for folks who are just doing audio. You don't see any of this stuff. You just have to take my word for it that I'm having a bad hair day and wearing a Knicks jersey. But Saudi Arabia is sort of inclined towards independence and letting folks do what they may, right? Not the most democratic, transparent country in the world, in theory, on paper. But so, thanking them for supporting them in Xinjiang is no surprise, although especially to sort of Muslim countries and people around the world, I think that's hypocritical, to say the least. But on top of that, what is surprising perhaps is that they thanked also, in addition to supporting them in Xinjiang, They thanked them for support in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And now Hong Kong and Taiwan are sort of these, it's like the line that China typically never crosses because they know that the US is always pushing hard against that. It's not quite the same as Russia and Ukraine to the extent that the Ukraine is clearly a country of its own, right? Autonomy and all of that, fairly well-established democracy at this point. But Taiwan and Hong Kong are both fairly well-established in their own rights as well as sort of independent, I don't know really what you'd call them, autonomous areas that are, of course, linked to China in most ways, but also somewhat in their own sphere, if you will. And certainly the US has always been very supportive of both entities. And so for Saudi Arabia to be providing support of any kind to China regarding them is of particular note for anyone who's watching. Saudi Arabia and the US relations are a little frosty. It was reported by good reporters at The Intercept that Crown Prince Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is a pro-Trump dude, not a big fan of Joe Biden. Obviously, Trump provided him with a lot of support financially and arms deals, right? Helping in Yemen, which I spoke about in the last episode, but also the Jamal Khashoggi thing, right? He didn't get a lot of heat over that from the United States. And I think freedom of press is something that the US, at least in theory, tries to protect, typically. And democracy and transparency and like extrajudicial murder is typically something the United States comes out against pretty hard. And so for Saudi Arabia to have gotten the pass that they did, I think was surprising to many. And so anyway, obviously it seems to have curried favor with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who has, we know, raised the price of oil and impacted inflation around the world and created instability, supposedly pointed at the Biden administration in the US, but obviously it's right. We talked about Kazakhstan and protests turning into riots with the price of gas being kind of igniter there. Of course, not the only cause of the problem. Don't want to oversimplify, but yeah, it's definitely fascinating that Saudi Arabia is taking this posture against the United States. Meanwhile, right, the U.S. not backing out of supporting them in Yemen, which I, again, spoke about last episode. Check it out. But, helping them with drone strikes, selling them weapons, right? It's not stopping despite, in fact, Joe Biden's promise to do that, which again, though, his promising that could potentially have contributed to this sort of anti-U.S. stance that the Crown Prince is taking now. But yeah, so supporting China is a big move. Saudi Arabia mentioned China's development over the last 10 years as well. I think perhaps indicating the fact that China's elevated position economically and politically in many ways has made them someone that has to be negotiated with and dealt with on the geopolitical scale at this point to larger degrees for any nation that's trying to take itself, seriously, or whatever that means, such as Saudi Arabia. So certainly an indication of progress for China in that sense, though I think for folks keeping tabs on the United States and allies and foes and, perhaps trying to grade Biden on that won't look particularly good for his rivals. Although on the other hand, I think Saudi Arabia is an entity that both parties could agree has always had outsized input on things here. So it should be interesting, actually, right? If Biden is someone who creates a sort of fissure between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, he could actually theoretically, in a kind of populist sense, get some credit from that from both sides if he played his cards right, I suppose. Much more, I think, than any sort of quagmire he could get into with Russia or China. Which we'll put a tab in, a feather in the cap on that. We'll leave that aside. That's it for Asia now, and just some interesting news, I suppose. Now, North America, and this is going to feed into talk of like other places. And I mentioned Kazakhstan already, and which we talked about a few episodes ago, and the unrest there. Now, there's unrest in Canada and the United States, and this is all related to vaccine mandate stuff, which, I think typically, folks who are coming out against vaccine mandates, specifically said this isn't, they had a huge protest in DC on January 23rd. They said this isn't an anti-vaccine movement, this is an anti-vaccine mandate movement. Well, the problem with that is that most people who've gotten the vaccine view getting it as a social responsibility, right? Like nobody wants to get shots in their arms and go through that. I personally hate shots, but I got my 3 of them, right? And I think folks view that as something you're doing for society at large to support folks who are immunocompromised and who are at more risk for whatever reasons. With that said, with that said, when someone talks about a mandate, it seems sort of irrelevant in the large scope of things. Like whether you're forced to get the vaccine or you're choosing to do it, you should, to the extent, right, that we don't, it's not really on the radar for most of us. So I think typically folks who are anti-mandate are truly anti-vaccine, and that's just an extension of the battlefield where that's moved, since so many people have already gotten vaccinated, that being anti-vaccine is now, I think, considered extreme enough. But whatever that is, so there was that big meeting, a lot of far-right individuals, and notably RFK Jr. has come out, which is, he's a man who's flown under the radar for a long time, despite, I think, planting the seeds for a lot of anti-vaccine stuff. He had a really prominent piece in Rolling Stone 15 years ago that really made the rounds, and I think really gave a lot of people a sense that vaccines could be dangerous. He linked it to autism, and much of it was debunked. And the problem here was that, to the extent that the article spread and became mainstream knowledge for a lot of folks on the left and right, the fact that it was debunked did not spread to that same extent. And so a lot of folks are not aware that a lot of the research done in that piece was faulty and incorrect and partial. But so he's come out of the woodworks, and not surprisingly, in this sort of anti-vaccine mandate stuff. It'd be nice if things started sticking to him, I guess. On the other hand, at least he's on people's radars now in the negative sense. But so that was in the United States. In Canada, more notably, there's this sort of big truckers movement, right? And the Freedom Convoy, as it's been dubbed. And there's a couple of notes on this one that I find interesting. One is that it's become such a sort of populist talking point, and a lot of sort of independent-minded folks on the left, Russell Brand and Glenn Greenwald and folks have come out and giving it sort of support. And I think for anyone really following things, they won't be too surprised, especially by those individuals glomming on, right? Because they've been moving in that direction throughout this pandemic sort of era that we're in. But I struggle to do that. It is a movement of the right. Like I've said, I think you can't really be anti-vaccine mandate and not be anti-vaccine, right? The Venn diagram of anti-mandate and anti-vaccine is like almost a full circle, I would say. So it's semantic, honestly, whether you're anti-mandate or anti-vaccine at this point, I would suggest. And another issue is that because it's this movement of the right, all of these other groups are attaching themselves. And like in the United States, in DC, notably, a lot of sort of far right movements, Proud Boys and stuff, were kicked out of the group of protesters. People didn't want to be associated with them. But if you're there and you're seeing these people trying to associate with you, it's probably, alarm bells are ringing, I would imagine. And then especially if you're in Canada now, and here's an image for folks on YouTube of the type of people joining in with the truckers convoy, and for folks who aren't on YouTube, they're neo-Nazis flashing swastikas and Nazi flags so they're fully involved, and which is of course ironic because anti-mandate, anti-vax folks typically are trying to call the governments Nazis or Nazi-like for trying to tell them what to do with their bodies or whatever. So for actual Nazis to be on their side, that must be confusing at the very least. But that's not even what I'm interested in here. What I'm kind of fascinated by is, so this truckers convoy has gone on so long and it's created so much traffic. There are not like non-protesters, folks who have just been trying to move places, who have been supposedly stuck in traffic from Saturday up until yesterday, which was Tuesday. So that's quite an inconvenience for some folks, you'd imagine. Now, there's a town called Couts, Coutts, which is sort of towards the end of the line of this traffic that's been created by truckers who are honking horns, trying to make as much noise as possible. I think that's more around the state capital or the country's capital. But anyhow, this town, Couts, small suburban town, mail's been disrupted. People can't get to schools, church, stuff like that. Like people have been thoroughly inconvenienced by this protest. And it's just ironic that for years on the left, when people have tried to shut down highways or, prevent people from resuming their normal lives to try to make them have their attention be on whatever the protesters are trying to get people to focus on. It's been a very, especially on the right, kind of rallying call, like, haha, look what they're willing to make ordinary independent folks go through to politicize things or to, get people's attention. And here they're doing exactly that. So, it just shows you that if you actually are trying to protest something, that's kind of what you have to do, right? You have to disrupt people to get their attention, whether whether that's a popular thing to do or not, in the eyes of a neutral. So it's actually like not that interesting on the one hand that they've had to resort to those tactics, because it's, I think, natural if you're actually trying to accomplish something via protest. But it is ironic, right? Because that's been a real criticism on their end. So it is what it is. But so yeah, that's what's happening in North America. And now moving to Africa quickly, and this is sort of a note, if you will. I started out episode 1 or 2 saying, I want to cover all the continents, and that includes Africa, and I don't want to just do negative news, coups, and what's the term I'm looking for? Mismanagement, right? Corruption. I want to do real news about Africa that kind of gives people a full sense of the continent. And for the most part, I think I've done some positive stories and everything. But there have been a ton of coups, right? In Sudan and Mali and most recently Burkina Faso. And it's unprecedented, right? Like I've kind of keep apologizing every episode for having to do that, despite what I said initially about how I didn't want to just focus on negative things. But so, interestingly, the New York Times just wrote an article about how this is an unprecedented time for coups throughout Africa. And so it's not just me, which on the one hand made me feel better. On the other hand, it's like, the Times is doing the whole coup thing again, right? Which it's sort of negative news, but it is legitimate. There are a ton of coups in African nations, and it's not good. It's instability. But on the other hand, I've had a long time to think about it since, having read the article. And it's really important to note how young these democracies are. And, that's not a criticism of Africa. In fact, it's a criticism of colonizers. It's a criticism of Europe, which, specifically France, England, right? A number of nations. And here's the case in point, right? With the exception of Liberia, which is a really weird, unique story upon itself, and I suggest you read up on that. With that one exception, the first nation in Africa to become independent was Ghana, and on March 6th of 1957. And the most recent was Zimbabwe. Bob Marley was singing about that not long ago. April 18th, 1980. So in that 23-year span, all of those nations gained their independence from colonizers, from colonial entities, which really speaks to how young these democracies are and why there's so much fluctuation. And we don't need to talk about why the times are creating change and fluctuation and chaos, right? Because it's happening everywhere. We talked about inflation because of the Saudis and the price of gas going up all over the world. We've talked about coronavirus and what the impact it's had on economics, right? On jobs and, with lockdowns and all of these things, various industries being shut down, essentially, for good reason. No criticism on my end, honestly. I think we didn't respond accordingly. We should have responded harder and faster, but been done with it sooner, in my opinion. But it goes without saying that there'd be a ton of unrest and a ton of uncertainty and a ton of chaos, especially where you have a ton of nations essentially in their infancy. And it's worth noting, right? The United States, we've had civil war here. We're not a particularly old democracy ourselves here in the United States. My family, much of my family on my mother's side is from Turkey. They came because of my mom, rather, and a number of people she knows, came because of a coup in Turkey. Turkey was ripe for coups. There were like a few every decade or so, honestly. On my wall here, right, we've got the Vietnam, North and South Vietnam conflict, right? I mean, the Infinity Wars. Now, we don't need to go to the Marvel canon, but I mean, civil wars are a product of democracies sort of figuring themselves out, of peoples figuring themselves, sorting things out. Democracy itself is not like a ancient concept, if we're going to be 100% honest, right? But especially in that region, they're still really sorting themselves out. And so the times that we live in and the chaos that comes as a product of all that is it's sort of inevitable that you'd see this kind of strife and chaos. And all you can really hope for is, like this latest example in Burkina Faso, and I still haven't verified, but they're claiming to have sort of non-violently, affected their junta, essentially. You hope for more of that, right? Like less violence, ideally, and you hope that whatever does come out of it, as things do calm down, right? Omicron, as I reported in the beginning of it, like as I sort of hoped, honestly, Omicron has proven to be weaker, much faster spreading, but weaker. And so it's kind of the best case scenario. Again, fingers crossed. For folks who are vaccinated, right? It's really not impacting people much anymore. And so, right, still fingers crossed. We hope the next strain and the one after that and the one after that, isn't somehow going to bring us back to where we were. But things are looking good. But anyway, as normalcy resumes, hopefully things will get better in Africa, and not just in Africa, but like I said, in North America, we've been dealing with craziness in Kazakhstan, and all over the world, honestly. Ukraine and Russia, right? I mean, the fact like oil is not a negligible factor in that dispute. Anyway, that's it for my global news this week. Just a few continents, but I'm gonna do my power rankings, and we're gonna talk about U.S. news. And it's like the U.S. media, what they're talking about the most, and through that, my views on things, I guess, a little bit, things that are happening here. So this is more for the gringos out there, or folks who are maybe interested in the news cycle here in the U.S. Number 5 on my power rankings, and a new entry. It's Tom Brady. And sorry, it's a fluff piece, if we're going to be honest. I hate Tom Brady. Personally, not a big fan of his. Not a big fan of his sport either. So I'm not my opinion is almost irrelevant. But he retired 22 years in the NFL. He's won something like 13% of all NFL championships at this point. Whoa, sorry, shaking the camera there. So yeah, he's retired. He retired. It was leaked that he was going to retire. He disputed it, so it seemed like, oh, he's coming back. And then he actually came out and officially retired today being February 2nd. So that's something, I guess. And certainly it's occupied the news feed more than it needed to. But so yeah, it happened. Good riddance. can have a few extra walnuts now that he doesn't have. I mean, he knows he had a crazy diet. I mean, he did play football on an unprecedented amount of time. He and LeBron James have reshaped how we view, the human body and what's possible. But yeah, in that sense, I guess there's a legacy at work for sure. But he can stop eating like a few walnuts per day or whatever his crazy diet was and enter the real world. Watch this man explode in like 2 weeks. Anyway, moving on to number 4 in our power rankings for media talking points. And it's the Senate. They're back. Although in this case, they're moving down, from number 3. And in my last segment a few weeks ago, in this case, and since we're covering a lot of time, this is a little dated, but there was a lot of talk about voting rights, and they tried to put Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin on the record, like make them vote against voting rights, and they tried to do it right before Martin Luther King Jr. Day, just to sort of show, like, yeah, you're against voting rights on the day that we're trying to represent this dude who sacrificed himself to get Black folks voting rights, right? Well, they missed the deadline by like 3 days, and so it completely left the cycle. They didn't get their gotcha moment. Of course, the voting rights were voted down. But anyway, so the Senate sort of fumbles yet again. And even the sort of well-intentioned folks in the Senate who are trying to like make a point of the jerks not doing the right thing, even they fumbled just through their typical, boomer, like, whoops, couldn't get around to it. Like we were on vacation and like had to get ourselves sorted, whatever. Anyway, so that was that. Number 3 in the press. And it could be number 1, arguably, just on any given day, right? But since we're covering the whole month and it's sort of new to the news cycle, like it wasn't even in the last one, which was already like more than a month ago, to be fair. Russia and Ukraine, and that shouldn't surprise anyone, right? It's a question of, does the U.S. get involved? How much does the U.S. get involved? Are there going to be sanctions? What will the sanctions look like? Right? I mean, is the U.S. doing good work diplomatically with the kind of allies that Joe Biden promised he'd bring back into the fold after Trump sort of peed all over the room, metaphorically? Lots of question marks, and still nobody quite knows. I mean, one eerie thing is the extent to which the Russians have they have blood banks lined up on the border for just in case. They have a lot of stuff being prepped. Apologies for the camera shaking. My cat just played with the wire for a minute there. Anyway, but so yeah, Russia and Ukraine obviously getting, in this case, I think justified hype. Number 2, and so that was a new one, so that's not moving up or down from anywhere. Number 2 is the Supreme Court, also somehow new to the news cycle. I guess not somehow. I think they've been in there previously in previous incarnations of power rankings because of like weird decisions, right? Like I think with Roe v. Wade, I talked about them. But in this case, Judge Breyer, kind of a liberal judge, one of the only 3. It's 63 stacked now for conservatives to rule, essentially. Judge Breyer is stepping down, and he's old enough that it's a wise thing to do. I think everyone with RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, wondered when she would step down, like during Obama's 2 terms, and then she didn't, and people were praying she would survive Trump, and she didn't. And so what was already 5-4 in favor of conservative judges, but usually weighed out by some of the more centrist versions of those iterations, if you will, became completely tipped in favor of conservatives. So in this case, I think, when you have Biden now and his term is not halfway through, you got to do what you can. And I think it was sort of noble of Judge Breyer to step down. I think it was the right thing to do. On the other hand, if he didn't, it would have been quite selfish and potentially fatal, because already the court is not. It's going to take a long time to flip any direction that will benefit good laws passing. But anyway, they've done a lot of damage already, like striking down vaccine stuff, mask mandates, striking down Roe v. Wade in certain cases. I mean, they're active now, getting juiced up with their 6-3 power. Anyway, number two, that was number two. That was the Supreme Court's number two. Number one is Trump. And he's up from number two in the last iteration of our power rankings. Trump's in the news. There's apparently been a ton more evidence found that he directly was trying to effectuate the January 6th insurrection. The commission is working overtime, even though we know they can't do anything except sort of like recommend minimal, like they can't do anything criminally, right? And there are criminal cases in Georgia and in other places in New York where they're trying to look into Trump's activities, especially financial stuff. But he's managing to stay in the news. The founder of the Oath Keepers apparently is going to show up for the January 6th commission, which I'm sure he'll just plead the fifth or something obnoxious. But apparently, like, former Pence aides have felt under attack enough by Trump, and he's back on the circuit talking trash and basically like riling people up for the next coup, which you'd think would be like pretty incriminating evidence, honestly. But I'm not sure he's actually criminally liable for any of this stuff. So I don't know. It's weird. But so Pence people, because he's drumming people up against Pence again, his former aides are coming out and helping the January 6th commission now and giving them information. So, I mean, who knows what comes of it? But again, I'm not convinced that this January 6th commission actually has any jurisdiction or power beyond, like, we recommend that someone, the Department of Justice, does something. And, there's no indication that they're definitely inclined to do so under Merrick Garland. He's been very, like, moderate. And I don't mean that politically. I mean, not stirring the boat, right? Not stirring the water, rocking the boat. Anyway, but so that's it. Trump back to number one in the media somehow, almost 2 years into the Biden presidency. I mean, that's not even true. We're just past a year, but like still Trump is dominating the airwaves, which, should spell doom, frankly, given we should be moving beyond him. We should be moving past him, folks. We don't need him anymore. Anyway, that's it for this week's episode. I'm going to skip the weird of the week this week. There are so many candidates, honestly, but with the power rankings and a little news, I don't want to run on too long. With that said, follow us on Twitter at LateStageTrib or on Instagram at LateStageTribune. Follow myself on Twitter at Sir_Writes_a lot. And as usual, hopefully next week, there'll be better news. But until then, see you around.